Apple has had a long history considering the company was founded in 1976, and over that period, we've seen changes in their product designs, but most people haven't noticed the subtle change in how Apple names their products. If you were an Apple fan in the early 2000s, you might have used an iMac, iBook, or iPod. But Apple fans today may be using an Apple Watch, Apple TV, or Apple Pencil. And although there are still products from what I call the i era, like the iPhone and iPad, it's worth exploring how Apple's product name strategy has changed over the last 2 decades and learn why those changes were made. This is Greg with Apple Explained, and I want to thank Ting for sponsoring this video. If you want to help decide which topics I cover, make sure you're subscribed, and voting polls like this one will show up in your mobile activity feed. Now, before we talk about Apple's naming strategy today, I want to take a look back and explain how it evolved over the company's history. Apple's first computer ever, created by Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs themselves back in 1976, was called the Apple I. Its successor, released a year later, was called the Apple II. It proved to be one of the most influential computers of that period and provided Apple with a steady stream of revenue for the next decade. And they would need it, since the company tried creating a follow-up computer in 1980 called the Apple III, which was primarily targeted to the business market, but it failed miserably, selling only 70,000 units in its lifetime, 20% of which were defective. At that point, Apple shifted their focus to other projects like the Macintosh. Now, the Macintosh project had been in the works since 1979 and was initially led by Jeff Raskin, the person responsible for naming the product. And the reason why Raskin chose the name Macintosh is because that was his favorite type of apple. Now, if you're familiar with apples, you might be wondering why Jeff Raskin spelt the word Macintosh wrong, since the Macintosh fruit is spelt without an A. Well, it turned out that the team decided to add the A in order to avoid trademark disputes with an audio company called Macintosh Laboratory. But unfortunately, that slight spelling difference didn't save Apple from trademark infringement. Steve Jobs was so desperate to keep the name that he actually wrote a letter to Macintosh Laboratory asking for permission to use the word Macintosh for their computer, since the team had become very attached to the name. But the president of Macintosh Labs denied Jobs' request. Eventually, in 1983, Apple was able to license the name, and then in 1986, they purchased the trademark outright for a reported $100,000, which is equal to almost $250,000 today. So that explains why Apple's revolutionary 1984 computer was called the Macintosh instead of the Apple IV, and that marked a very significant point in the company's history, since most of their following machines would continue using the Mac name. Now, there were exceptions beginning in the early 90s, when Apple named their first notebook computer the PowerBook. But in the late 90s, with Steve Jobs' return, the company continued to leave the Mac name out of their notebook computers with the introduction of the iBook. But it's very important to understand why this decision was made. Because looking back today, it seems strange that Jobs would name a notebook computer iBook instead of MacBook, especially when he was part of the original Macintosh team who fought to secure the name. But you have to consider the iBook in the context of Apple's product line at the time. Because 1 year before it was released, Apple had introduced the iMac, which at the time became the company's most successful product in history and helped save them from bankruptcy. And considering the iMac was the first product to use the i prefix, it made sense that Apple would capitalize on the name's popularity by using the lowercase I in other products like the iBook, which was marketed as an iMac to go, adopting its translucence, colors, and bulbous design. It also had a built-in handle like the iMac. Now, if you're wondering why Apple chose the name iMac in the first place, it's because the I was supposed to stand for Internet, which the iMac was primarily built for. But there were additional meanings ascribed to the letter, like individual, instruct, inform, and inspire. It's also worth pointing out that the name was created by Ken Segall with the ad agency Chiat Day, and initially Steve Jobs didn't like it, instead suggesting the name MacMan, which he found particularly appealing. But no one else did, with Segall saying the name made his blood curdle. So the following week, Jobs was presented with more names to choose from, but he rejected all of them. From then on, the ad agency didn't hear anything directly from Apple, but they did have friends that told them Jobs was testing the name iMac on prototypes of the computer, trying to decide whether or not it looked good. And apparently it did, because the final product was named iMac, which came to a surprise to Segall. He said, "Jobs rejected it twice, but then it just appeared on the machine. He never formally accepted it." But something I think people would be more than happy to accept is paying less for their phone bill with Ting, a mobile carrier that actually makes sense, because they charge you based on how much data you use instead of an arbitrary amount every month. When you call them for help or support, you talk to a real person at no extra cost. There's no holds, no transfers, and no robots. And since you only pay for what you use, the average Ting bill is just $23 a month per device. Now, if you're stuck in a contract but want to switch to Ting, they'll actually cover 25% of your cancellation fee up to $75. So head over to ae.ting.com, you can find that link in the description, and try out their bill estimator. Enter how many minutes, text, and how much data you use on average based on your last bill, and you can see how much you'd save with Ting. Then, when you sign up with our link, you'll receive a $25 credit toward your service bill or a new device. That link again is ae.ting.com. So with the iMac and iBook enjoying more success than Apple could have ever wished for, and with the company roaring back to profitability, the i prefix became a very valuable asset. And that's why it was used for the vast majority of new Apple products during that era. Their music player released in 2001 was called the iPod, their smartphone released in 2007 was called the iPhone, and their tablet released in 2010 was called the iPad. The i prefix became so strongly associated with Apple that they actually filed for a trademark on the letter, arguing that no other company should be able to use it since customers will think those products are made by Apple. But their case failed in 2010, with the court asserting that a person of ordinary intelligence and memory would not assume that just because a product has the letter I, it was made by Apple. And this is when things started to get interesting, because 2010 is about the time when Apple stopped using I for new products. For example, in 2015, the company released the Apple Watch, a product which many expected to be called the iWatch. In fact, Tim Cook was asked this exact question during an interview with Dave Rubenstein. He said, "Why was it called the Apple Watch and not the iWatch? Because you have the iPhone, iPod, and iPad, why not iWatch?" Cook replied, "It was something we thought of at the time, but I kind of like Apple Watch. What do you think?" So while we didn't get any real insight from that non-answer, I do think it suggests Apple is simply moving in a different direction when it comes to their naming strategy. They could have named it the iWatch, but they chose Apple Watch instead. And I think one of the reasons is the name Apple is trademarked, whereas the I prefix is not. So when a customer is shopping for a smartwatch and they see the name Apple Watch, there's no question who makes the product. This is also an effective branding strategy which forces customers to directly associate a product with a company. For example, when I was young, many of my friends didn't know about the company called Apple, but they all knew about the iPod. So maybe if it was called the Apple Music Player instead of iPod, there would have been more brand awareness among my peers. Now, this sort of name strategy is nothing new to Apple. Remember the iBook? Well, that product doesn't exist anymore, and it's because Apple replaced the iBook with the MacBook in 2006. Steve Jobs even gave a reason for the name change, saying, "We wanted all our computers to have the word Mac in them," which is also the reason why they replaced the PowerBook with the MacBook Pro the same year. And that exact same naming approach is taking place today. We have the Apple Pencil instead of iPencil, Apple Card instead of iCard, and Apple TV instead of iTV. Although I should make it clear that the Apple TV was introduced in 2006 and really shouldn't be included in the i to Apple transition happening today, mainly because Apple wanted to name the product iTV and it was internally referred to as such until just weeks before its release. Its name was changed to Apple TV last minute due to a copyright dispute with a British television network of the same name. That's why if you watch the 2006 sneak peek, Steve Jobs introduced the product as the iTV. But then when they realized they couldn't win the trademark dispute, they were forced to use the name Apple TV instead. But that could be considered a happy accident for the company, since the Apple TV appears to have kicked off a naming strategy in Apple's product line that proved to be useful after they failed to secure the I prefix trademark 3 years later. And it's quite clear when Apple made the decision to stop using I, with the iPad in 2010 being the last product to feature the prefix. But this shift didn't only apply to hardware, it was carried through to Apple's software as well. In iOS 11.3, Apple renamed the iBooks app simply Books. In 2015, the iPhotos application in macOS became Photos. And finally, in macOS Catalina, Apple completely rewrote the iTunes application and called it Music instead. So it's pretty undeniable that Apple is no longer interested in the i suffix. But this brings up a problem. What's going to happen to their existing i products, two of which are Apple's most successful in history, the iPhone and iPad? Well, there are a few possibilities based on how Apple has handled these situations in the past. First, Apple may change the product's names when a new version is released, just like with the iBook and PowerBook. The iPhone could become the Apple phone in the near future. But considering how recognizable the name iPhone has become globally, I doubt it'll change. So that brings me to the second possibility. Apple could simply keep the names as they are until a completely new product cannibalizes them, similar to what happened with the iPod. Apple introduced the iPhone, and it caused iPod sales to shrink so dramatically that most of the models were eventually discontinued. Or finally, Apple may keep the i in their existing products and simply avoid the prefix for new products, which has been the case so far. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.